So I will make a note. We do have closed captioning available for today's webinar. I'm going to put some directions for that in the chat. And I'm going to officially start us. So welcome, everyone. We are excited to have you with us today. We are recording our session, so thank you for joining us. To save bandwidth for all of our participants and for the recording, we do ask if you are not presenting to turn off your camera and mute yourself during the presentation. I will be monitoring the chat, so you can share your questions there and I'll share them with our presenter. Amanda Brown is running tech for us today. Thank you, Amanda. As I said, we are recording, so Alice will be sending out the recording of this webinar in a few days in a follow-up email. If you're uncomfortable with your name showing, you can change your name to anonymous and private message Amanda with your name for our attendance. Also, please, if your Zoom name doesn't match the name you registered with, if you could change your name or let Amanda know, that would be fantastic. I'm going to go ahead and do our land acknowledgement. Texas Children in Nature Network is headquartered in Austin, and as such, I'm on the ancestral and unceded land of the Tonkawa, Comanche, and Sauna people. Our ongoing colonial presence on Indigenous lands compels us to take action now to counteract the effects of colonization. The work we do through the Texas Children in Nature Network is one small step towards that effort, and I'm going to put a couple of links in the chat about those people groups and about land acknowledgements. And I'd like to go ahead and welcome our speaker today, Jaime Gonzalez. Jaime is with the Nature Conservancy in Houston and is an active partner in our Houston Regional Collaborative. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Jaime.
Okay, I am sharing. Can you all see my screen? It should say wildly healthy, climate ready. All right. Well, thank you for having me here today. I am very proudly embedded in the Children Nature movement here in Texas. Just real quickly, I will tell you a couple things
Jaime,
about.
sorry.
Yeah.
We can see your desktop. We can't see the presentation.
Let me go ahead and stop and reshare.
I just realized that.
Okay. Here we go. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Never know what's going to work. Like I said, I've been involved with the Texas Children Nature movement for a long time, and helped to write the first Children Nature rollout plan back in 2010, and it's been a fascinating journey. And so I'm going to go ahead and do a couple things today. One is I'm going to try to give you an idea of where I am with my programming, and how I think it relates to kind of some larger things that could be happening in children nature to kind of synchronize a few things. Now, I'm going to let you know that some of the stuff I'm talking about may or may not apply to each one of us. We're all in a different place. But I think that there's some commonalities in terms of what this all looks like across the state and some opportunities coming up. So I'm going to go ahead and start. And so what we're going to do is we're not going to cover all these bubbles of what I do as the Houston Healthy Cities Program Director or what we do at TNC or anything like that. But I do want to give you an opportunity to kind of dive into a couple of projects that I do that kind of bring this kind of intersected work together. And what I'm hoping happens is at the end of this, we'll have some time for Q&A, and not just from me to you, but rather from you to me to other people on this call. I always find that it's tough to have all this expertise sitting in the audience and not saying anything. So if we can have a 360 conversation after that, I think that would be really great. So let me go ahead and jump in. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I was gonna say, it looks like we're just on your not presented screen starting. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm gonna go ahead and
perfect.
Present here and admit. Okay, can you guys see that? Okay, so if I go like this, you're getting inside the bubble?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so just real quickly, I will tell you a little bit about TNC and who we are and why we do what we do. So real quickly, TNC is, as you know, you may or may not know, is a very large international conservation group. We work in about 77 countries, all 50 states. We have about 46 We work in Texas and had worked in Texas since the mid-60s. And a lot of our work has really centered around land conservation. So we're about to pass a milestone of 1 million acres protected. So that's a rich legacy. It's 54 out of every 100 acres that's been protected privately in Texas was TNC had a hand in. And so, as many of you know, we protect amazing places like this. This is the Nash Prairie Preserve, which is just south of Houston. This will factor very large in our conversation today. This is an ancient old growth prairie, which is very rare. And we use this as a place to cultivate seeds, to practice techniques in terms of ecological restoration. It serves as very important wildlife habitat, and it's kind of indicative of where the Nature Conservancy has spent the last 70 years in protecting some of the last great places in nature across the state. And if you take a look around the state, our imprint is in many, many places. So these are all some of the public land assists that we've had by ecoregion. Land assist is basically we either purchase the land or help to purchase the land or put together the financing or the expertise in order to get that land. And then we transfer it over to somebody, some institution that can shepherd that place. So a lot of these places that we have transferred or helped to raise funding for are now state parks or national wildlife refuges. And there are some of the kind of most iconic places like Lost Maples and Enchanted Rock, and a lot of our coastal national wildlife refuges. We have some places up in the Big Thicket. So it's kind of all over the state. And that is a very, like I said, it's a very proud heritage. And right now we are looking to make some really bold work towards climate resiliency and biodiversity. And so this will only be done in partnership with communities on the ground, with governments, with industry. So these are some of the things that we're going after. And like I said, this isn't TNC by itself. This is only going to be done in cooperation with a lot of different groups, but they're big lofty goals, like 45 million people supported, saving 650 million acres. And we're doing a lot of these with other big nonprofits like World Wildlife Fund and other partners, but also state agencies and municipalities and private landowners and things like that. So that's the kind of the typical TNC thing. And it is, like I said, really something to be proud of. But we also work in cities, and a lot of people don't know that we actually work in cities. So these are the cities that we work in. This is the cities network for 2022. So we have programs in Houston and Dallas. We used to have one in Austin as well, but that transition. But you can tell that there's big projects all along the Eastern Seaboard. In Chicago, St. Louis is doing great stuff. Denver, and it's because of this right here, right? A lot of times people, when I talk to them, they're kind of like, TNC's in a city, but I have to remind them, right, that Texas is 85% urban and the United States is 83% urban. So when you look at where the people live, that is really going to be very influential in how conservation is or is not sustainable and where we're going to have impact in terms of protecting people from the ravages of climate change. Another factor plays into this, and that is my local context. Like, what is Houston, right? So Houston is the most ethnically diverse major metro area in the United States, and it doesn't take you long to walk around this city and recognize just how many countries people come from and other states that live here in Houston. It's very common for people to have friends from all over the world. I certainly do. But it's also got another distinction, which is it's a biodiversity hotspot city, one of only 2 in the United States. And what that means is that it's a place of exceptional biodiversity that is at risk from development. So like many of our Texas cities, we have phenomenal growth and it's eating into a lot of local habitats. That being said, there's still a lot of hope. There's a program that we help to coordinate for the regional area called the City Nature Challenge, which has been really a fun way of engaging community scientists to better understand and to record biodiversity. A couple other facts about Houston are very important when we think about the type of intersected work that I'm working on and that other folks in our network are working on. One is that Houston is very disaster prone. So we are living in a place where climate enhanced disasters are picking up pace. We've had 500-year floods or more, 500-year floods or more events since 2015, including this one. This is Hurricane Harvey, which struck Houston in 2017. It's the reason I work for TNC. I was working for another conservation group here locally. But it became very clear that biodiversity conservation was really important to me, but that we had these systemic challenges where nature and nature-based solutions could be the basis of getting us to a more resilient place, a more equitable place, and a safer place to be. So this is a short video. Hopefully this will play. We'll see if this plays for you. This is my house during Hurricane Harvey. The Hurricane Harvey was a 30,000-year event in some parts of the county. And there's my kayak.
Higher ground. Here's all of our stuff heading to my parents-in-law on Ashwood.
Those are people being rescued 2 streets away from my house via Coast Guard helicopter. Thank God for the Coast Guard. And so what we're seeing in our community is we're seeing resiliency, really bad resiliency issues. And it's not just flooding. Heat is becoming a really bad problem in Texas. And in fact, if you take a look at some of the data from Climate Central, it becomes very apparent what we're up against. So summertime temperatures have gone up by 5.3% or 5.3 degrees Fahrenheit since 1970, 2 years before I was born. If you look at the average number of warmer summer days, it's gone up 51 days since basically I was born, one day per year that I've been alive, basically. So this is starting to create a pattern. And I just saw this the other day, which is this extreme belt heat belt study. So if you look at that, a lot of the eastern part of our state's going to be in this belt that may get temperatures of 125 degrees in terms of a heat index for at least one day a year. We also have tremendous amount of damage that's going on. So this is from Catherine Hayhoe, who's a very famous international climate scientist, who's our chief scientist at TNC now. And it talks about how much of the direct costs of Hurricane Harvey, which were 125 billion with a B dollars, were caused by climate change. But the real problem is not just the economic damage, but the damage to communities and the damage to other people. There's a climate justice ambassador to her community. This person is serving as an ambassador community to talk about climate change and inequity. She is 5 years out from Hurricane Harvey. Only half of her house has walls still. So there is a great kind of mythology in Houston that we bounce back quickly from Harvey, but it's always a tale of two cities. Some people have not bounced back, and it ate away at their generational wealth and their ability to help their children. And we're also sitting, to be completely honest, in a place that has some of the most massive and pronounced environmental justice issues, including water issues and air issues and soil issues in the United States. It is an epicenter for the environmental justice movement because it is needed. We're sitting in a city that has a life expectancy. Not all of this is due to environmental quality, but it plays a role where the average life expectancy spans 20 years between the community with the least amount of longevity to the most amount. So what do you do with a city that is very complicated, very diverse? It has very threatened biodiversity. The people in communities are suffering from lots of inequalities and environmental justice issues, which really are, they have an unhealthy environment. So nature has been damaged in some way or is not present in some way, so it's inequitable. So what do you do? Well, what I've chosen to do is to lean into my life experience and also to lean into what is possible for this next stage of what I think of when I think of action for children, nature, and equity. And so just real quickly, a little bit about me. I'm a prairie ecologist. I've restored a lot of prairies and taught about prairies. I'm an environmental educator, so I'm trained in environmental education and trained in environmental communications. And I'm a network weaver, so I weave lots of networks, climate resiliency, prairies, education, because I feel like I need to have as many tools in the toolbox. This is a very complicated work, and we are all, what I say, we're all colleagues on this call, all on the same team, different logos, same team. So just real quickly about why I'm passionate about this work of intersecting biodiversity conservation, human health and well-being, kids and nature, and all that stuff. It's because I have some lived experience. So if you take a look, this is where I grew up and got in connection with nature when I was a kid. So this is up in Aldine, which is just north of Houston. So my home was there. As you take a look, all that forested land was secondary forest. That big kind of rectangle was a remnant prairie, where I found my love of prairies. And so I spent a lot of time outside doing things like putting in trees with my dad and gardening. And right behind that fence, you can't see it, but there was a wild prairie where I used to go and try to find black-tailed jackrabbits. And I hung out with my brother and sister, and we played a lot of nature. And this is what my backyard looked like growing up. It's a great place to find nature and to get in contact and start loving it. You know, we saw all sorts of wildlife, and I just became enamored with it. And that, along with Wild Kingdom and trips to the zoo, really made me want to become a conservationist at some point, even though I took a few twists and turns. Well, long story short, my family, there was an oil bust here in town. We had to find a job. My dad had to find a job. And so we decided to move back to the neighborhood in which I was born, and ended up going to high school. And this is in North Philadelphia. North Philadelphia is like Aldine in that it's a disinvested community that never had enough money for park space, for health services, for other services, a lot of inequity. And I moved to the poorest zip code in the city, right here in North Philadelphia. And the thing about disinvested neighborhoods is they're full of life. And so sometimes people say things like, oh, it's a bad neighborhood. That's a very simplistic way of looking at places, and it's very damaging to the people that are there. There are places that don't have as much money, that are disinvested, that are prone to things like systemic racism and things like that. But they are full of life. People live their lives. People take joy. They have fiestas, and like this one here in North Philadelphia on Fifth Street. But at the end of the day, there are challenges. And some of those challenges come because inequitable access to nature. So this is my block in high school. This is in North Philly. As you can see, there's not a tree. There is not a shrub. There is not very much nature at all, except for a few plants in the crack of the street there. This is a damaging landscape. Sometimes we think about all those nature benefits as you add nature, but the research is pretty clear that hard environments like this, nature-free environments like this, or nature-poor environments like this, actually damage self-esteem, actually damage self-efficacy, feelings of self-worth, and other things. So not only are the folks in this neighborhood carrying additional burdens in terms of educational attainment and disinvestment and systemic racism, but literally their mental health and physical health is being damaged because there are no trees to protect them from pollutants. There are no trees to soak up water. And there's very little places to find that biophilia, that love of nature. And that's a basic human right, nature, right? It was even enshrined by the UN last year. So a lot of my motivation for doing the work that I do to save nature and help people comes from this lived reality. And this is one of the things that, as we talk about diversity in the conservation movements or the children of nature movements or the environmental movements, that's part of why it's important. You need to have people that have lived different lives and experienced different things. So what do we do? Well, before I go into the two projects I'm going to talk about, I'm going to say two things. One is that we have to work across landscapes that are connected. So this is, in many ways, I joke that this is my preserve. This is the greater Houston region. It's not protected by any mountains, so any hurricanes that come in come all the way up through the city. Any flooding that goes down passes through those green arteries in the city. The peoples in this region are all connected in many different ways: economic, sociologically, ecologically, all of that stuff. pollution that's made in the ship channel doesn't stay in the ship channel. It goes towards neighborhoods both proximate and upwind. So sometimes there are these weird air pollution issues. So if we are going to uplift and save some of the best biodiversity in the US and restore and repair neighborhoods that need more nature, including for kids, and kids are always at the center of my thinking when I do this kind of work with partners, we have to first understand that there should be no gray areas on conservation maps. Every place counts all the time. And so if we are to make a future conservation movement that really values people and diversity and equity, cities have got to be an integrated, fully valued part of that, of conservation planning maps. But we also have to think about what conservation means, where it operates, and to provide new vehicles for that. So one of the things that I'm doing is I'm working in what's called a One Health model. Conservation is fantastic. It's done really great work. I'm proud to be a conservationist, but it has limitations. And also environmental justice does amazing work, and it has limitations. Public health does amazing work, and it has limitations. So one of the things that we can do is not to change each other into each other, but rather to conceive of a dance floor. And I think of this dance floor as One Health, where the sectors of environmental justice, equity, conservation, environmental justice can find common cause. So what interventions can we make in communities at the ground level to provide children with more nature while making their communities more resilient? What sorts of solutions can we come up with that not only uplift the health and equity of a human community, but also serves the needs of the rest of nature? How do we redefine what a community is to always mean a living community, the people and the rest of the species in one spot? So this is why we'll need to conceive of a different model for how we look at community health. And that's why I'm working with the University of Alaska at Fairbanks, our cities network, and Harris County Public Health on trying to figure out if we're really doing urban planning and action, and also planning anywhere that we work, and even in rural communities, to uplift human health and the rest of the species. Well, how do we need to talk about this? What kinds of research do we need? And what sorts of nature-based solutions can we make? So that if we were successful, when we say Houstonians, we won't, or Dallasites, or Austinites, or wherever you're from, when we say the word community, it no longer means just this, it means this. So, and I'm dead serious about this, because at the end of this movie, which is the journey that we're on together to make a survivable planet, if we don't get here where we really internalize that every single living of the member of a community counts, none of us are going to get to where we want or need to be. So we're trying to both do good work on the ground, but we're also trying to reset the frame. And here's one reason. It's because when you have communities that have inequities, when you have communities that are overburdened with pollution, climate change impacts, and those things, it also heavily impacts and is impacted by the lack of nature. There was just a research paper that was done last year. It was brilliant, and I got to present alongside one of the researchers. And basically the upshot of this is that wherever you have disinvestment or systemic racism impacting a community, the biodiversity of that community is lessened greatly. And in fact, you could sometimes use the biodiversity of a neighborhood as a proxy for what the disparities in human health and justice are. That's a powerful connection. And what it says is that sometimes the needs of biodiversity and the needs of people are put in opposition. But the truth is that you have a living community of other species and humans that are impacted by the forces of colonialism and systemic racism and disinvestment. So it's really that living community fighting the forces of that are harming them, not people needs versus nature needs. And that's something that still needs a lot of work for people to kind of internalize that. So what I'm going to do is, before we go on, because this is going to take a little bit of time to delve into a couple of projects I'm working on where we're trying to bring a One Health framing to the interventions for kids. I want to ask if there are any questions before we go on.
We don't have any right now in the chat.
All right, cool. Becky Lumen, I'm glad to see you on here. She's one of my biggest allies in the fight to make a more kind of living, beautiful, nature-rich city. All right, so I'm going to tell you a couple of projects that we're working on and how they attend to this One Health of the community. One, I just came back from yesterday. So we're working on a project in Alief ISD, which is just southwest of the city center. It is part of Houston. It's what is called a complete community, and complete communities are 10 communities that are designated by the city of Houston, where the city wants to work with many partners to leverage resources to get better services to those neighborhoods for the folks that deserve it. Alief is one of those communities. There's another community called Gulfton, which I'll talk about, that I'm also working in. We're not constrained to complete communities, but they're kind of a focus of our program because we work a lot with the city in terms of climate readiness and resiliency, and the city's connecting children with nature. So city's been a really great partner to us. We're working real closely with them. So as you know, for those of you who have put in school gardens and school habitats, like the one you see behind this frame, it is extremely important work. I commend all of you who've done it. I've helped put in about 35 habitats in schools across the region. It is super necessary and super important, but it is also a little bit of a tough system in that it is almost fully dependent on having teachers who are already overworked and underpaid dig in to their own personal money or their non-existent time to raise funds, to do the stewardship, to do all of that. And as you know, as a teacher leaves that institution, oftentimes the habitat declines or is replaced or gets taken out all the way because teacher turnover is very high in our school system. It always has been. It's just getting worse. So I had an opportunity to work with one of the most ingenious school architects in the country. Her name is Melissa Turnbaugh. Here she is right here with my great colleague, Aaron Schamelin, who works to protect and restore our preserves here just outside of Houston. And she said, well, what if we flip the script a little bit? So maybe instead of building the campus and putting some of the world's worst soil on it, and then creating giant lawns that need to be mowed, what if we created a more ecologically healthy campus? So we started talking. We brought in great partners like Texas A&M Forest Service, Healthy Tweaks, Green Star Wetland Farm, a bunch of different Harris County Public Health. And we started talking about, like, what would it look like to actually do a real ecological restoration on a campus so that most of the campus is ecology, not mowed lawn. What would the impacts be? What would the benefits be? And what would it look like and feel like? Well, hence the Jefferson Early Learning Center, which opened up this fall. We've been working on it for nearly 2 years in terms of planning and restoration. The restoration is ongoing. But basically what we did is, instead of, like I said, creating a campus, putting a bunch of grass on it, and then having these tiny habitats, this is what it looks like. So all the kind of teal areas are wetland areas. The lighter green areas are prairie areas, and we were just out there seed drilling in more seeds for the spring. So we have about 4.5 acres of prairie wetlands. This is the biggest kind of pocket prairie system I've ever in place. I've put some stuff in the Texas Medical Center and other places, but this is by far the biggest. And we have about 200 trees on the campus as well. And so what we're doing here, in my mind, is really doing a couple things. One is we're attending to the fact that as wonderful it is to get preschoolers, and these are preschoolers, about 400 plus preschoolers in Alief ISD. And instead of asking folks that may not have resources to go to a place like the Houston Arboretum or Memorial Park or Herman Park, which are great places that we support, maybe having their school as a mini national park might be a better answer, not only for nature equity and all the health and scholastic benefits it brings, but also for climate readiness. Can we make neighborhoods more climate ready because school campuses look different than they did before? Now, it's wildly different looking than any campus I've ever worked at. And so part of it is reaching out to the community, reaching out to the educators, the administrators, the school district, to learn how to live and thrive with a natural system like this. And so far, it's going really, really well. And so here's what it looks like in construction detail. You can start to see these lines are where kind of, we had some erosion control. So it's taking up a significant part of the campus. But why would we want to do this? Well, there are several reasons. One is the children who are going to the school are predominantly lower income. It's hyper diverse. Alief is one of our most diverse neighborhoods in the city. Most of them live in apartment complexes. So this is one of their best bets for daily doses of nature, which we know will do the best for them. But there's also many other resiliency and health benefits for managing a landscape like this. Number one is that we have a lot of places in Houston that are climate damaging and ecologically damaging. We have probably the largest land class in our region is mowed lawn. Not in our region, but in our county. Mowed lawns come in an excruciatingly a very high ecological and health cost. Mowing a yard for about an hour is the equivalent in terms of pollution, both climate damaging carbon and noxious chemicals, of driving a car for about 200 miles. Well, when you have tens and tens of thousands of acres of mowed area, including around schools, what you're doing is you're heavily polluting the air. You're limiting wildlife habitat. You're limiting cooling as well for a city that is getting way hotter real fast, because short lawns do not transpire much water in comparison to urban grasslands. We actually made some measurements with Harris County Public Health, and the difference between a pocket prairie and a lawn like you see under schoolyards in the middle of summer was 17 degrees Fahrenheit. So we're also talking about making a cooler city using the power of nature. And lastly, these spaces and schoolyards that are mowed are culturally vapid. And what I mean by that is there's very little opportunity for kids to connect to the cultural undercurrents of their place if they have nothing but lawn. So I use prairies a lot because they have many ecological benefits, but they also connect to our long history of Western heritage, prairies, rodeos, barbecues, all those stuff. It's placemaking. And placemaking is a quality of life issue. If you feel like you're rooted in place, it's going to be really important. So this is one place I think that is really great in that it also demonstrates one other thing, which is this. We need wild habitats. We need these preserves that TNC, Parks and Wildlife, Fish and Wildlife Service, and many other land trusts across our state have saved. Why? One is they're models for what restoration needs to look like in cities and suburbs in order to make them more ecologically healthy. But they also serve two other reasons: seeds. So one of the things that we have done at the Alief Early Childhood Center is about 50% of the seeds that we've used on the project were purchased. The other 50% came from our preserves. They were harvested on preserves on the periphery of our city because they have the genetic memory, they have the resiliency that we want, and because we think that they have a place and space in places. So this is Aaron Shyamalan with his dog, and he is standing in a field of what's called false indigo. So he harvested this property, Nash Prairie, which I showed you earlier, and other places to get me hundreds of pounds of seeds to do this restoration at Alief. And he also used his knowledge of prairie restoration to help. So this is a good example of what I call country preserves, city resiliency. And in the process, what we're going to do is, by creating these habitats, is we're also going to be able to get and attend to biodiversity. These are all species that, if this campus matures over the next couple of decades, these are species that may be seen by these preschoolers. You would be amazed once you start building nature at that scale, and I've done multiple projects at that scale, but not on a school campus, how quickly things return. So I went out yesterday, I documented multiple species of dragonflies, our first wintering sparrows. This thing isn't grown in yet. We're getting wintering sparrows, we're getting egrets, we're getting all sorts of species, just checking it out. We've had some hawks already. So what we're doing is we're building relatively big nature on a school campus. I've made a iNaturalist project for it so we can track it and work with local university students to track kind of how is biodiversity being impacted, because this isn't just for the people, right? It's also for the wild residents of that neighborhood. So that's one project. A much more, and that's, here's the theory of change for this project. At least in Houston, I don't know about other cities, but in Houston, you can make change from two different directions. You can either make it top down or bottom up. So top down is things like finance, planning, science, policy, and filter down. Or, and this probably works exactly like where you're coming from, you can make demonstration projects on the ground that cause the kinds of conversations, political capital, and processes to filter up into systemic change. So one of the things that we're looking to do is we're looking to use this campus as a flagship project where we can take superintendents, we can take mayors, we can take county commissioners, we can take people from local ISD school boards to say, as you do your work of doing school bonding, and there's two really large school districts that are going to go to bonding next fall, Houston ISD and Fort Bend ISD. Let's think about how you maximize the use of that public space for kids, for wildlife, for park space, for community benefit. Let's stop wasting public infrastructure by creating a one function place, which is just a school. Let's create an integrated space that has many, many benefits and many, many functions. And by the way, we're doing a triple bottom line analysis. So the economic, environmental, and ecological benefits over a 10-year lifespan of doing this project versus a vanilla project. And we should be publishing that probably in the first part of the year. We'll share that out with you, but we've gotten some preliminary numbers. We need to correct a few things, knowing what the actual costs were at this point, but very positive return on investment. So if you're just a numbers person, it also works. And truthfully, if you look at the total project cost for the Jefferson Early Learning Center versus the amount that we've spent to do it better, it's very, very tiny in comparison with doing it the more traditional way. So we think that there's a really good argument to be made from a human health and well-being standpoint, a scholastic achievement standpoint, and just a plain old economic standpoint. Plus, this is going to be a much cooler place to be, right? All right. This other project I'll just tell you quickly about, and then we'll go ahead and get some conversation going. A much more ambitious project is looking at climate readiness and nature equity at a neighborhood level. So if we're going to have a more climate ready, and when I say a climate ready and wildly healthy Texas, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to plan at the right scales. And for me, planning at the neighborhood scale makes a lot of sense because of how the way politics lay out, how the way that funding lays out in terms of storytelling, all of that. And so we've worked for over a year with a really highly diverse suite of stakeholders, community groups, urban planners, biologists, health professionals, community development people, to craft what is called the Greener Gulfton Plan. The Greener Gulfton Plan is being done in a neighborhood called Gulfton. And Gulfton, this is kind of a polygon. I didn't really tell you about the people, which are really amazing people. Gulfton sits kind of southwest of Houston, up as far out as Alief. It's pretty close to the city core. At one point, it was housing lots of young career energy workers in the 70s and early 80s. And so they built these gigantic apartment complexes which dominate the landscape, and they left very little room for nature itself. And so in 2020, we helped organize the biggest community science project in US history. We did it all throughout Harris County and all of Houston. And what we found is this community, because it had lack of tree canopy cover, was 17 degrees hotter in August than the coolest community. So you can see this kind of breakdown. And the plan is out, so I'll shoot you the plan so you can read it online. But basically, if you look at Gulfton and we broke it up into 4 zones, it's suffering very disproportionately from climate enhanced heat. It's got a lower tree canopy cover. It's more floodable in some places. The connectivity is an issue. It has a huge amount of like pedestrian auto accidents. But on the positive side, it is the most diverse community, I think, in the state of Texas. There were over 70 different languages spoken there. In fact, when we did community outreach, we did it in English, Spanish, and Arabic. We didn't quite have the budget to do it in Swahili as well, but we could have certainly done that if we had enough money. So we hired 6 community ambassadors to be our liaisons to the community, and we got to work looking at all the data, looking at everything, getting community feedback. And what we found was that people, and kind of understandably so, wanted more nature for their kids. And they didn't want to have to drive a long way to go get nature. They wanted it right there and smack dab in the middle of the community. And they wanted it for all the reasons that we all want nature: for beauty, for cultural connection, for many who had Indigenous heritage. They wanted to remember not only their ancestors, but the ancestral land, people of that land, who were the Karankawa. And they wanted also to be protected from heat and storms and everything that we wanted to be connected to. So what we came up with was a plan that we are getting ready to strategize about activating that called for 7 big things. One is fix the one park in the community. That park is called Burnett Balin Park. Very underfunded. I actually lived across the street from Burnett Balin Park when I was in college for 2 years because I needed affordable housing. It's a park that I used when I was in college, and it's very disinvested. So fortunately, the county just commissioned a master planning process, so we're leaning in there. Initiating cooler corridors, so planting trees or shade in strategic areas so that as people transit the neighborhood, they're cooler. Doing things like activating an urban forestry strategy to mitigate heat, to capture rainwater, to improve air quality, stormwater, greenland, wetlands on one side, increase capacity, and also make nature-rich civic spaces. So in all of this, my ideas, I'm a very visual person, so I'm always visualizing what is a child going to see if this plan is successful in 5 years. But it doesn't really matter what I think. I'm going to let Sandra Rodriguez, who's one of the leaders of the community, tell you what she wants to see.
Needed for Gulfton. A greening plan and a nature plan is needed for Gulfton because if you visit, if you live in it, work, worship, play in it, you see that there is absolutely very little green space, very little tree canopies. Personally, as someone who has lived in the area for almost 40 years, as I was raising my kiddos, I, at that time, did not have the funds to take my kids to go camping, go to a state park, or even barely make it to Galveston, to expose my children to nature. I did take them to the zoo and to other areas in the city, but why can't I take my kids just down the street to a neighborhood park to have access to it? I don't want to drive across the city for them to experience nature. We live in an apartment complex, and many of our residents and neighbors live in an apartment complex, and even in the properties, there is no access to green space, very limited access to green space. When you see our children playing outside and recreation activities, they're playing in the parking lot. They're playing soccer in the parking lot, playing dodgeball or whatever, they're out in the parking lot. That is not a conducive environment for my kids. And so I think it's also helpful for our mental wellness, for our physical health, and for us to breathe the fresh air. I can tell the difference when I'm in the neighborhood and there's no green space. But if I go to an area where it's very luscious and just all these trees and all this green around me, I can tell the difference in the quality of the air. So I think just having a greener neighborhood, a greener Gulfton creates a healthier environment for communities to thrive.
All right, she goes on and she's just brilliant. But basically the upshot is, and the thesis is, and I'll just show you one more thing that we're up to, which is really trying to think about how we connect neighborhood to neighborhood so that if a kid wants to have an adventure, have an 8-year-old, he doesn't have to get in a car and go somewhere. Now, I love nature centers, started my career at a nature center, worked at wildlife preserves, love those too on the periphery of the city. But my idea is that you should be able to get on a bike and have a nature adventure. And so one thing that we're working on is we're working on some connecting projects. So one day we hope that we can be a part of creating a ecological corridor through the middle of the city. There's some old growth prairies where it says Lightning Bug Prairie Plot 2 that we're trying to preserve. And maybe there'll be a spur that goes over to Gulfton right there, all the way into Memorial Park, where we're working with amazing partners at Memorial Park Conservancy on their project, the Prairie and Land Bridge project, to make the state's biggest wildlife crossing, wildlife bridge crossing. It's opening on December 10th. It is amazingly gigantic if you have not seen this. And again, we're using the seeds that we harvested on our preserves to restore the area in the upper left-hand corner. And these kinds of things can go very quick. This is a prairie that we had a hand in restoring, and Aaron Shumlin, and with seeds from and just 1 year later, that's what it looked like. And then I worked with Rice University students to figure out, well, how are the pollinators responding and what's the carbon holding capacity? So at the end of the day, I'll wrap up by saying, if we're going to make a nature-rich world for children so that they can experience it, it's going to have to be all of the above. It's going to have to be everything from getting kids who don't have access to state parks and national wildlife refuge ways of accessing those public goods. It's going to have to be making sure that their schools have as much nature as it can possibly hold and be maintained. And it's going to have to land in their neighborhoods so that the daily exposure to nature, which brings the really, truly wonderful health benefits of nature, are felt by everybody. And there's just been some recent research that was fascinating on loneliness and how loneliness is a precursor to a lot of chronic diseases, including cardiovascular disease and diabetes and other things. And they looked at the power of nature to combat loneliness. And I'll send you the paper, but basically the upshot is they looked at 2 variables: civic spaces. So how do civic spaces, places where people meet, drive down loneliness? And it was substantial. You might get that just intuitively. But places where people could see and connect with something bigger than themselves, trees, the sky, other species, also drove down feelings of loneliness by 19%. So if we create a greener Gulfton, greener school campuses, not only are you creating better wildlife habitat, you're basically improving the mental health care of the community, and you're making health clinics in the wild. So what do we do next? Well, what we do next is to recognize that if we can get environmental justice, children's advocates, conservation advocates, equity advocates, and public health advocates together in rooms to discuss possibilities for funding like this. This is a game changer. So the Inflation Reduction Act, which many of you know passed here recently, has massive amounts of money to address environmental justice issues. About $65 billion with a B dollars. We've never seen that sort of pot of money come down. There are other initiatives in the federal government, like the Justice 40 initiative, where 40% of the benefits of the federal government are going to go to communities in need. So you're going to have billions of dollars. And then you also may have this pass, which I've been working on for like 5 years. It's called the Recovering America's Wildlife Act, to take action to safeguard species of greatest conservation need. Well, if you start blending funding, what you can do is you can build a heck of a lot of nature to meet multiple benefits all simultaneously. So what we're doing right now is we are working to build a working group here in the greater Houston area. And these talks are very preliminary, but there are multiple conversations going on right now. And the flavor of those conversations is, how can we work in common cause across differences to draw down a lot of this federal funding to reforest the city, or afforest it, because it wasn't a forest in the beginning, it was a prairie, but to put millions of trees back in the city, to build green storm water, to put in more urban grasslands and pocket prairies all throughout the city, to make this a garden city that is healthier, because the trees are cleaning the air and intercepting the water, and the wetlands are cleaning the water and providing wildlife habitat, and the prairies are doing all that stuff. How do we make a garden city that is fairer, that's healthier, and more biodiverse, because we are working in unison? And the challenge is very daunting. It's extremely complicated. We're working across differences that have built up over decades. But I think that if we can use something like a One Health lens to really kind of bring people to the table, I think we can do some real good for kids, so that as they look around their neighborhood, they see what other kids get in other neighborhoods. And if we're successful in doing that, then I think it's going to be wonderful. So I'm going to leave it there, save some time for questions and commentary, and even some perspectives about what you're doing. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. And I'm going to...
Jaime, we've got some questions already in the chat for you.
Okay.
The first of a few from Melody, specifically about the Jefferson Early Learning Center. Her first question is, who's responsible for maintaining the new features at the school? Can you speak on maintenance for a bit?
Yeah, so definitely 100% not the teachers. That was the whole problem with the old model. It's operations and maintenance. They've budgeted for the maintenance, the ongoing maintenance of the project. But in terms of maintenance costs, we're going to go from, lawns that are typically, we have a subtropical climate here, so sometimes they get mowed 20 to 30 times a year, depending on how well funded the ISD is, to mowing those prairie wetlands once to twice a year. So you're going to have a lot fewer emissions, but you're also going to have reduced costs for the school district. And over years, that's going to add up, and maintenance budgets are always tight. So we wanted to take that completely out of the hands of the teachers, to say, teachers, if you want to do restoration work and train up these future conservationists or earth stewards, that's great, but that shouldn't be on your plate too. If you want to do that, that's great. If you just want to teach out there, that's awesome too. The school district has really big equipment to handle this sort of thing. It's going to be done by tractor, the mowing. The trees, we're going to be caretaking those for about a couple of years in terms of making sure that they get enough water. There's been some real damage to the trees because of the mini drought that we were in, but we're going to address that as well. So it's really not on the teachers. It is on operations and maintenance. And if we go for school bond funding, and if we're successful in moving decision makers to put that in, we're going to make sure that they have the budget that they need in order to properly maintain those habitats and the training. So we're going to be working on some training manuals too, for how do you maintain something like this? Great question.
And then a follow-up to that is, how are you working with the code department? We often put in meadows and then get code violations.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I'll tell you that is a work in progress, because what's happening now is that there is a mismatch between city ordinances and stated resiliency goals in terms of nature. So you have neighborhood protection that might be at odds with the resiliency office, because we know that these natural habitats are more resilient, they're more healthy, but because codes were made at a time where a lawn was the American dream, and that's what people coded for good neighbors, there's a mismatch. So we're going to have to work out what that mismatch looks like. But because ISDs are kind of their own thing, we're not having an issue with that, because the city and the ISD are separate entities. Same thing happened when we put in a pocket prairie in the middle of the Texas Medical Center. It's on the UT MD Anderson campus, so that's a state institution. It's and so the neighborhood department didn't really have jurisdiction over that. So we've been lucky in these two circumstances. But as we build more pocket prairies and more wetlands and other things and tiny forests and whatnot into the city, we're going to have to work that out because it is a mismatch that continues to limit what we can do in the city. Great question.
And we have a question from Mary. She asks about traditional alternatives to traditional grass lawn in Houston.
There isn't one. We've been trying to work on this for the community of folks, that we work with have been trying to work on this for a long time. In the Austin, Dallas San Antonio region, as many of you probably know, there's something called thunder turf. There's another thing called habiturf. It's the same thing. It's a selection of like 4 or 5 native grasses that don't grow very tall, that don't need a lot of water, that can serve as a turf grass substitute. Houston has too much rain. And so when we try those species here, they rot and they're not sustainable. And all the native grasses that we have here, we don't have great candidates for a lawn grass replacement. So instead of that, what we do is we talk to people about replacing their lawn with butterfly gardens, with tiny forests, with other things, because we just don't have a good lawn substitute here.
And then Robin asks, how can we get involved with your efforts? How do we contact you to work on these things?
Yeah, so I'm going to put my email in the chat. One thing is, you know, I'm working to come up with a couple of volunteer dates for the Jefferson Early Learning Center. We're going to put in some tall grasses and some wildflower seeds. We're going to do a wildflower seeding in early December, and then we're going to be doing a big grass planting in early January. So you can certainly get involved in that way. As we start to have conversations about, you know, how do we pull down some of this money, that's going to be a community conversation. So I think as we try to rally around 2 or 3 big flags, you know, we're going to definitely call on people to be active. And also there's a potential, you know, I'm really hoping that with the Houston, Texas Children in Nature, or the Houston Cities Connecting Children in Nature team, that we can work with PBK and others to kind of formulate a strategy for trying to influence school bonding in the next few years with these big school districts and school design guidelines as well. So I think there's multiple ways of getting involved. Some are kind of a hands-on and some are more kind of policy-based. So
we have a very special question from Kai for you, which is, how much longer do I have to wait until I see Jaime's name on my voting ballot?
After last night's elections, probably a long time. No, I appreciate that, but you know, you know, it's just one of the, I'm having too much fun right now. You know, it's a very challenging environment and very challenging way of working. But if we're able to turn the corner on this, we can, you know, we can make a lot of progress. We can really green the city up for everybody, humans and wild creatures included, and get to the place where we need to be. So I appreciate that, Kai.
Those are all the questions we have in the chat right now. We are just about out of time, and I'll give everyone a moment if there's another question that pops up. But I do want to put our evaluation for today in the chat as well. So if you could take a moment and fill out our evaluation, it helps us give feedback to our presenters, and then also help us plan our next webinars. And then just a reminder, our summit is less than a month away. It's hard to believe that it is getting that close, but we hope that all of you can join us there. Jaime is going to be doing a session about A-Leaf, I believe, as part of the conference, and then we'll hear from lots of other great projects as well. But thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah. Let me just leave them with one note. I'm reworking this presentation about the projects we're doing. It is on Prezi. I do Prezi presentations because they all live online, and I got tired of compatibility issues, but it has a lot of power. And so once I reformat everything in this presentation, I'll go ahead and send it on to you as a link, and you can just view it online. So if you are tired of doing PowerPoints or keynotes and you want to try kind of the next step, Prezi is a really good platform. I just highly recommend it.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us today, and hope you all have a wonderful rest of your afternoon.